As a prepper, it can be very beneficial to you to understand and know some history that you can then apply to current events and use that information to be more strategic about your planning. And that's what we can do right now based on the gas crisis that our nation is facing. Right now, gasoline's national average price just hit over $5 a gallon, which is very concerning. However, we've seen things like this in the past. During the 1970s, there was a similar gas crisis, and we can use that information from the 1970s to understand what to expect here in the coming months and how they're going to try to fix the problem and whether or not that's going to work. So this is important for you to pay attention to because what we can expect here soon is likely going to be very reminiscent as to what happened in the 1970s. Now, the 1970s gas crisis was caused by many different factors, but two of the main factors, which were at two different points in the 1970s where this gas crisis existed, were basically wars, okay? So you had the Yom Kippur War, which was a war between Israel and some other Arab countries, which the United States obviously supported Israel, so there was some backlash from Saudi Arabia at the time saying that they didn't like America's support of Israel, which means they cranked up the price of oil. And then there's also the Iranian Revolution, where the new Iranian government retaliated against America for supporting the overthrown Shah of Iran and basically made the price of oil go up once again. There was embargoes and other things in the works, so a lot of different factors came into play and created this gas crisis scenario. But we can look at what's happening there. We understand there's a conflict going on in Eastern Europe right now, and we can understand how a lot of the similarities are in play that gives us some information to work with when planning what to do here in the coming months, all right? Domestic oil production was also low in the United States during the 1970s. So obviously, domestic oil is a big deal, and if it's not being produced or if certain pipelines are being shut down or who knows what else, well, that's going to be detrimental for us to get out of this mess, all right? The cost of living went up, but gas was the main focus back then. So understand that gas affects everything, no matter what it is. It could be food, it could be technology, it could be travel, whatever it is, it's affected by fuel and the cost of said fuel, which is then passed on to the consumer. So expect the cost of living to go up. The same thing happened in the 1970s. However, the focus was on the gas itself because not only was it expensive, but it was scarce. And that's exactly what we can see from that whole scenario and apply it to what we're dealing with here in the future, I guess is what we'll call it now, based on the fact that not only is gas a problem for us, but we have issues with other supply chain items such as food, technology, and many other things that have the same exact scenario occurring right this second, all right? Now, during the gas crisis, drivers would wait in lines that were miles long and for hours at a time. 5-mile long lines were not uncommon during the 1970s for people to try to get gasoline. You can assume that that would be a very chaotic scene at this point in time in this day and age. It would not be as pleasant as it was in the 1970s, and even then, it wasn't very pleasant, okay? Stations used different call signs to let people know if they had gas or not, so they would use things like flags. They would have a red flag to say they had no gas, a yellow flag would say they were rationing gas, or a green flag meant they were good to go. They also used some things like odds and even rules, where basically if you had an odd number at the end of your license plate, you could only come in at certain days of the week, and if you had an even number, you would get the other days of the week, and there was no gas being sold on Sunday at all because it just made it so there was one less day where the demand was there. So there's a lot of different regulations and things put into place to try to fix this whole gas problem, but this was all coming from the gas stations themselves and them deciding their own pecking order in the sense of who got gas and who didn't. But the government didn't really fix the problem, but they had some ideas, okay? Now, during this time, during all of this happening, fights would break out at the stations. It got dangerous in many ways. People would get mad about someone else getting gas when they couldn't. People would get mad about people jumping in line or who knows what else. And a lot of gas station owners started arming up. They would hire armed security, and it started to look a little bit more, let's just say, egregious to go get gasoline. It wasn't just a pleasant situation where you pulled up and got your tank topped off, all right? So there was even protests and riots spurred because of this gasoline shortage. The protests in 1979, the second time around during this gas crisis after the Iranian Revolution, was in Pennsylvania. And basically what happened was it came back around the second time. People had had enough, and the truckers were the ones who really brought it full circle and started protesting, blocking off highways, and basically saying, give us gas now, okay? That's the point that it got to, and especially because it was the second time around. And it's strange when you think about it, because there's some things we've done here recently that a lot of people didn't like, that if they were to come back for the second time around, I don't think people would take as kindly to them either. Now, do you? Okay. Now, what did the government do to try to fix this problem? Okay, and now why I just said what I said is something I also want to have you keep in mind during the rest of this conversation, but I'll talk about it at the end of this next part just so we can kind of have a little bit of a recap. But basically, the US government did a few things, and whether or not they worked is a different story, but one of the things they did was they cut the national speed limit down to 55 miles per hour. That was in order to make people conserve more gas, okay? Seems like a relatively easy thing to do, but it's still the government telling people they can't go the speed they were used to be able to go. So that's one thing that people are going to be upset about, but it is what it is, okay? They also implemented daylight savings time year round. I believe that started in 1974. And what that did was it basically made it so everybody's on the same time. So economically as a whole, it made more sense to be more conservative with money in the sense of the energy sector by doing that. Now, a lot of people are mad about that because in northern states, suddenly everybody's waking up and it's still dark out. There's a lot of things about daylight savings time that people don't like, but this was one of their ways of trying to fix the problem, all right? You can see that these lingering problem fixers or solutions, you might call them, haven't necessarily been well received and haven't really done a whole lot over the years, but here they still are, right? Now, here's something else they did. They put in price controls and supply controls. And now what you have to understand about that is that those were eventually lifted because people weren't having it, and people didn't like being told that they could only buy this much gas or they could only get this much. And the problem is because once you put price caps into play, you also have to put rationing into play. Because if you price cap gasoline at a certain price that is still affordable, and everybody knows that there's this huge issue with gasoline and that it's scarce and hard to come by, well, everyone's going to go out and buy it anyway. Okay, so that doesn't help a scarcity or a shortage situation unless you then ration it. So the government found out very quickly that by putting a price cap on, the rationing had to come with it, and then the problem wasn't really solved. People were still told they could only have a little bit of gas, and they weren't happy about that either. Rather than letting the market figure it out by letting prices go through the roof, where people just can't afford it at a certain point, they went with the price cap route and had their day with that, and it is what it is. Did it work? Well, technically it might have worked, but also a lot of other things were going on with embargoes and with foreign affairs, and basically the global stage at that point in time that timed out really, really well with those price caps being lifted. So there's a lot of wiggle room as to what actually worked. But what it did show is that if you put price caps on, you have to ration. So if we see price caps happening here soon, we know that rationing has to come with it. Because if it doesn't, then what happens? It'll all run out. So they have to come together. Or they allow for the price caps to stay off, which means you and I might be priced out of gas, but that will inherently stop us from buying it, which will then allow it to gain more supply and limit the demand, which should lower the price, right? But during that situation, you and I no longer have access to gas either. So they both have their downside, regardless of how you look at it. It's not really a win-win, it's a lose-lose. It's just how you lose is different, all right? The other thing to keep in mind is that by doing price controls, you de-incentivize producers of oil to rank up or to crank up their production, okay? Because now it's not as profitable because price controls are put into place. Whereas if you don't put price controls into place, those companies are now more incentivized to produce more oil and get the price down by having more supply. There's a lot of different moving parts. It's really hard to say what works best and what will do the job for us here in the country, okay? Now, the thing I want you to keep in mind is that not only can we expect things I don't think we're going to see speed limits change, and I don't think we're going to see daylight savings time, this or that. But I do think we'll see price controls if it gets too out of control, especially with the inflation of everything else going on. And then if that happens, I think rationing has to occur. And if that's the case, then you have to expect being rationed on what fuel you're allowed to have or not. And based on what you do for a living or how far you commute or whatever it is, this is going to be very detrimental to you, and it's going to make the cost of living more expensive no matter what, even if you don't have a car. So this is going to be problematic for all of us, but this is their only way of trying to fix the problem, all right? Now, the other thing to keep in mind and why I wanted to touch back on that after this part of the conversation is because a couple years ago, when that whole thing happened where everybody was told they had to do something and they didn't like it, and then if it were to happen again, they would probably react in a way that wasn't pleasant. Well, I can also say that 2 years ago, during that time, oil crashed. In fact, it was negative per barrel. You had to pay someone to store it because they couldn't get rid of it. Why? Well, no one was driving, no one was flying, things weren't moving. So the demand for gas went to the ground and below it, which means if they really wanted to lower the price and they really wanted to cut demand, I mean, there's probably one way they could do it. But that's something I want you to think about, because not only should you expect riots and protests and basically civil disruption at gas pumps if this thing continually gets worse, not only should you expect the government to put in new regulations, including rationing of fuel, but you should also expect that they'll take anything they've learned from previous history, just like you and I are doing right now, and apply it to the problem and say, well, there was that one time where we could shut off the gas and make it really cheap. This is something you need to keep in mind. I wanted you to be aware of it. The correlations are there. We have to be prepared to not either be able to afford fuel or to be told we can only have so much. And only those two options are really the only way that this is going to go. So I want you to be aware of that. And honestly, right now it's already unaffordable. So it won't take much more for us to hit that point now, will it? If you have anything else for me, leave it in the comments below. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prep.